The Bataan Death March was an horrific event that killed 20,000 prisoners after the fall of the Philippines in 1942. The Bataan Death March was an atrocity perpetrated by the Imperial Japanese Army on Allied POWs in the Philippine Commonwealth from April 9th until April 15, 1942. In the aftermath of Japan's invasion of the Philippines on December 8, 1941, the day after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the American and Filipino defenders that formed U.S.A.F.F.E, or the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, fought on in the Bataan Peninsula for 3 months, but surrendered in the first week of April. Nearly 80,000 prisoners of war marched into captivity and were made to travel on foot from the Bataan Peninsula, located northwest of the Philippine capital Manila, to internment camps in the Luzon plains, some 62 miles 100 kilometers away. It is estimated as many as 20,000 perished in the Bataan Death March from sickness, starvation, and violence. After the Japanese invasion of the Philippines on December 8, 1941, as part of WWII's Pacific War, the U.S.A.F.F.E were quickly overwhelmed and on the back foot. On paper, the Allied forces in the region were an impressive overseas army, trained and led by Americans and furnished with airplanes, howitzers, ships, and tanks. Thousands of Filipino conscripts meant it had the manpower and resources to beat a full-scale Japanese invasion. In reality, the Japanese soon achieved air superiority over much of Luzon, a large northern island of the Philippine archipelago. They landed their troops in several locations, with minimal resistance encountered all before Christmas Eve. Carefully drawn plans for stopping the Japanese proved unfeasible, but U.S. officers falsely reassured their troops that help was arriving soon. As early as December 9th, a naval convoy sailing from Manila was rerouted by the Department of War to Hawaii and then Brisbane, Australia, according to Lewis Morton's book, The Fall of the Philippines, St. John's Press, 2016. No other efforts to resupply the Philippines were carried out. In a last bid to hold out against the enemy, the commander of U.S.A.F.E, General Douglas MacArthur, ordered the initiation of War Plan Orange, or WPO3, which meant a phased retreat to the Bataan Peninsula that guarded the entrance to Manila Bay. On December 26th, the capital Manila was declared an open city by President Manuel L. Quezon, following the advice of MacArthur to spare the metropolitan area from possible ravages of attack, according to Official Gazette, the official journal of the Republic of the Philippines. The Japanese 14th Army under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma routed the Allies in the Luzon plains and took Manila. In early January 1942, the 14th Army concentrated efforts on Bataan, where as many as 80,000 Allied troops were now trapped. The Allies' plan was to hold out until the promised reinforcements from Australia and Hawaii could arrive. The Bataan landmass was split into 2 sectors, each held by a corps-sized formation. General Edward P. King was on the ground organizing layers of defenses that repulsed Japanese attacks on land and sea until March 1942. The struggle for Bataan was bitter yet futile, although it did inspire Allied propaganda around the battling bastards, a title American troops embraced after General MacArthur and his staff escaped the Philippines on March 11th. The Allied troops in the Bataan Peninsula were suffering not only from fatigue and disease, but also from the feeling of abandonment, wrote Stephen By, a U.S. Army historian. Eventually, supplies of canned meat and juice, then ammunition and medicine dwindled. Disease spread among the Americans because of foul drinking water, spreading tropical dysentery that roiled their bowels. On April 3rd, the Japanese army, reinforced with fresh divisions from mainland China, the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, launched an attack by air and land. The opening bombardment caused brush fires that so terrified the Filipinos, the entire Bataan front fell to pieces. Stragglers poured to the rear until they clogged all roads. Units disappeared into the jungle, an army evaporated into thin air, wrote Morton. Days later, General King met with the Japanese and set terms of surrender. The men and women under him did not have large enough ships to escape Bataan by sea. Although a few thousand, including many exhausted nurses, reached the nearby island fortress of Corregidor, where General Wainwright's headquarters still held on.
By this point in time, General MacArthur and staff were gone. Between John and April 1942, the Japanese besieged Fortress Corregidor with artillery and airstrikes, leaving the island in total ruin.
The face of Corregidor, once almost garden-like, a kind of military resort with flowers and lawns and clubs and pools, was now a wasteland, denuded of its natural beauty, reduced to gray rubble and piles of dust in the crosshairs of 100 thundering cannon, wrote Elizabeth Norman in We Band of Angels. Meanwhile in Bataan, the Allied troops destroyed their heavy weapons to prevent the enemy from capturing them. Knots of tired refugees and straggling soldiers clogged the road, and the trucks, buses, jeeps, and battered sedans that carried many of the women were broke down or were stuck in traffic, wrote Norman.
Once the Americans and Filipinos were relieved of weapons, their captors berated them for surrendering.
The rabid militarists who took over Japan inculcated in their soldiers a contempt for the defeated and a hate for other races, the white race included, wrote Norman.
This explained the scorn and ill treatment the Japanese exhibited toward Allied POWs.
On April 7, the U.S.A.F.F.E remnants mustered in the foothills of the Bataan Peninsula's dormant volcanoes, long overgrown by wilderness. The Japanese moved freely as they collected the surrendered. All in all, the official post-war tally of POWs in Luzon in 1942 puts it between 10,000 to 12,000 Americans and between 60,000 to 70,000 Filipinos. The total casualties from the Bataan Death March is estimated at 11,000, according to the U.S. Army's official history, with the majority being Filipinos. The death toll among the Americans varies from approximately 1,000 to as high as 5,000. In May 1942, another 12,000 Americans marched into captivity after Corregidor surrendered.
This was the largest internment of American forces in wartime.
By comparison, during the entire length of the United States commitment in the Vietnam War, 1965 to 1973, less than 800 prisoners were taken captive by the North Vietnamese. In 1942, almost 100,000 Americans, soldiers, civilians, women and children, were held as POWs by the Japanese in varying circumstances. The movement of POWs from the Bataan Peninsula to the central Luzon Plain, where Camp O'Donnell was located along with the secondary internment area Camp Cabanatuan. The majority of the POWs were still able-bodied, but the addition of so many walking wounded, the sick and the diseased would portend the difficulties to come. The Japanese army did not spare the trucks needed to move the POWs.
The awful part was the nearest railway depot in San Fernando was at least 31 miles, 50 kilometers away from Mariveles, which was the tip of the Bataan Peninsula.
In April 1942, the heat in the region was compounded by mud and dust as columns of prisoners began their march toward the railway. The Bataan Death March lasted a full week from April 9th until 15, but dragged on for several more days because of the thousands involved. The American POWs were exhausted by the time they left their former stronghold. The Filipinos managed a little better under their Japanese captors, although they were not spared scorn and punishment. Many of them were raised in the countryside, meaning they knew how to forage fruit and edible leaves. American POWs had the opposite experience. Once they were in captivity, these soldiers went through a hard day's march with just muddy water for sustenance. Some of the men had reached a state of mind bordering insanity from the lack of water. In desperation, they would scoop it up from stagnant pools in the road ditches. A stagnant pool is virtually alive with dysentery germs, wrote Ernest Miller, a colonel and former POW who survived the event in his book, Bataan Uncensored, Barajima Books, 2020, one of the most detailed accounts of the march. When the prisoners reached to the San Fernando railway terminal, the Japanese packed scores of them inside boxcars without ventilation on the brief 3-hour journey north to Camp O'Donnell. Another account recalls the brutality the guards unleashed on their prisoners. Eyewitness Corporal James Bullock later recalled one of his fellow prisoners being punished when he was caught with an empty water bottle. They beat him over the head with the bottle until it broke and kept on beating him with the broken glass. I don't know if he survived. Bullock wrote in his memoir, Bataan Death March, A Soldier's Story, Pelican, 2003. Those prisoners who made it to Camp O'Donnell were kept in their former barracks, now overcrowded with exhausted POWs. Dysentery spread because of the open latrines and the millions of flies around them, wrote Ballage.
Sick men were also covered in flies, especially those near the latrine, because the latrine itself held the greatest number. It is no wonder under these conditions that so many of the prisoners died.
Another eyewitness to atrocities during the Bataan Death March was the American spy Claire Phillips, whose husband perished in Bataan. Recovering from malaria while in hiding, Phillips watched the POWs from a distance through binoculars and later tried organizing burial parties for the corpses left behind. Phillips claims she witnessed the Japanese executing prisoners. Occasionally, a man would drop, and then one of his little tormentors would run a bayonet through him and kick his body down the road, wrote Phillips in Manila Espionage, Lulu.com, 2017. Her account matches the testimonies of other survivors who saw executions and homicides by Japanese soldiers up close. It was later estimated between 20,000 to 24,000 POWs died in their captivity, along with unspecified civilians. More Filipinos were killed in the march than Americans, which explains the catastrophic death toll. By the summer of 1942, Filipino POWs were granted a form of amnesty as long as they joined the local police force under Japanese leadership. Beginning in July, the U.S. prisoners who recovered from illness and starvation were sent to Japan aboard merchant vessels once used for hauling cargo, repurposed into pens for human chattel. Survivors of these journeys described their ordeal. They'd American GIs cut and bit each other in the arms and legs, and sucked their blood, survivor John M. Jacobs recalled to Prologue magazine. General MacArthur and the U.S. Army began their reconquest of the Philippines in October 1944, according to the official Gazette. After 5 months, the Japanese were either wiped out or routed from island after island, and as many as 4,000 Allied prisoners were rescued in places such as the University of Santo Tomas and the Manila City Jail. On its own, the U.S. Army organized separate war crimes trials in late 1945, and this meant General Homa was prosecuted and sentenced to death by firing squad, which was carried out on April 3, 1946. His downfall in the eyes of his judges were the thousands who perished in the Bataan Death March. Today, the Philippines reserves April 9th as a special holiday, Araw ng Kagitingan, or Day of Valor, to remember those who perished in Bataan and Corregidor. Since 1989, active service members of the U.S. military, along with volunteers, have participated in the annual Bataan Memorial Death March at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. The marathon attracts thousands of participants each year, who brave a 25 miles 40 kilometers hike over rugged desert terrain. Survivors are known to participate well into their 90s and centenaries,